We're back. I hope you had a lovely lunch. If you did not, well, it's a bit too late. It looks like it's basically about to leave. The ship has sailed. So welcome back. And we're going to explore together the weird, explore the queer, which is fitting for an entire conference on exploring liminalities. And so without further ado, let actually the moderator for the session, Ludwig, basically go about what he has planned for the rest of us.
So thanks so much, Eva. Welcome, everyone. We're very happy to be here. We're very happy to be in this venue with this topic, which is queer futures. And we're going to go through a few introductory slides. Then we're going to have 3 presentations. We will try to make it a little interactive with the audience as well. But as 1 hour is considerably short, we're going to see how we end up. We did not rehearse this. We got the slides together today. It's a really, we could say, a panel on the go. And very happy to have our panelists here. Going to introduce them in a bit. Going through a few introductory slides. Those of you who had the chance to go to Anticipation conference in Phoenix, they may have walked by this rock a few times, or they may have seen this Carter a couple of times on campus. And what you see there is this organization defines itself through whom we include rather than who we exclude. And I was wondering, so who do we actually really include and exclude when we do a conference like this in Phoenix or in Paris? So these are a few words that come up, and you see liminal spaces. It's right in the middle of it. So people who find themselves maybe not in the center, not in the mainstream, they may end up at the margins. And then the word trans comes up, which essentially means across. There's something in my way, and we do a lot of transformative, transgressive research in futures. But what does that mean to go across, really? So for all those we exclude, maybe without thinking too much about it, I want to let Emerson Munduruku, a Brazilian eco-activist, speak with his amazing body art, who actually has a queer identity, is really open about it, and uses his body and really steps into the river, as you can see, to voice how he interacts or how he senses the ecosystem feels around him. So that maybe as a little introduction, then another official welcome also from my organization, Fraunhofer Germany. You see, we have really resourceful speakers, 5 of them here on the panel. We have Josefa with us, who's going to co-organize the workshop tomorrow morning at 9. Be welcome. And yeah, let's step right into it. Why do we talk about queer futures? What could be actually a purpose and a sense for this community gathering here at this conference? So if you look at those curves, and I was brought up as a very rational mathematical person, those developments are not so linear as indicated, but you see the current dominance of foresight, where this community makes their revenue, right, has their business models placed. You see it's coming from a more predictive, from a more forecasting based paradigm, and it's moving towards softer, more open, maybe less defined paradigms of future knowledge creation. And you could say that some of us are already working in the critical, reflexive, speculative, design-based world, but few of us are probably really working in a post-trans and queer world, even fewer in the weird or what will come after. So that was motivating to ask what's really coming and how are these ways of knowing really co-evolving and maybe converging in our practices. So this is what we discussed with define the talks we're going to hear in a minute. And just to look into the literature, this is basically everything we found on the whole www about queer futures. There's loads of queer theory, has been around for decades, but it has hardly come together with future studies. So this is what we wanted to explore also from a scientific side of it. And that actually brings us right to our first talk by Dr. Ryan Prout. When did you arrive, Ryan? Yesterday? Ryan is a senior reader in the University of Cardiff. He teaches in languages. Ever since his PhD, he's been involved deeply in queer theory. That's been going on for a couple of decades. Ryan is also a political activist in queer matters, one could say. He has been active in a union advocating for LGBTQ rights. And Ryan put together a presentation where we asked him, how can queer theory influence futures thinking, future making, both from an epistemological point of view, but also from a methodological point of view. So this is what we asked Ryan. How can queer theory and futures go together? And I would say you have the floor, Ryan.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much, Ludwig, for the invitation to take part. I feel a really big sense of imposter syndrome at the moment because I only got into this in July when I went to the amazing summer school that Roumiana and other colleagues who are here today organized. So if this is wrong and I haven't done my homework correctly, I can only apologize. Ludwig asked me to, is this to make the slides go forward? Oh, okay. Ludwig asked me to include some content based on my experience of working in LGBT studies and as an activist in the union movement. So I begin there, in fact, even a little further back. So the first part of this is, I guess, auto-ethnographical, and then there's some more speculative parts. When I was a child, the children in the street where I lived used to play underneath an enormous Lebanese cedar tree. It was in the center of a lawn and faced by a row of 4 houses, the most expensive ones. The inhabitants thought of this public space as their private front garden. On one occasion, one of them emerged to shriek at us for making too much noise. I answered her back and asked her what difference any of it made when we would all quite certainly soon be fried in a nuclear apocalypse. The future to me then seemed like something that would inevitably be curtailed by catastrophe. That grim viewpoint may have been influenced by screenings at school of Threads, a notoriously grim British documentary about the radioactive scavenger lifestyle that would follow the bomb, or from one of the documentaries popular on television at the time about the inevitability of a new ice age. That was what we were expecting in the 70s. Looking back, that apocalypticism seems to me as being of a piece with the experiences of a proto-queer child who already felt detached from the general direction of travel, albeit without knowing why. In Becomings in Weirding Worlds, Jim Dator says, I never had ethnicity, I never had a father, I never had a family history, and that's one of the reasons I became a futurist, I think. I didn't have a past that was telling me how to behave. I needed to find my own identity. He goes on to say that he learned to be a man from his childless aunt, a veteran who discovered she was a lesbian at the age of 80. This resonated with me and also with some of my reading of queer theory that notes the strangeness experienced by queer offspring who, for all that we love our family and siblings, nevertheless can feel like intruders in the nest. Lee Edelman's No Future from 2004 made sense to me and made some sense of those earlier experiences. On the other hand, it was not just the maladjustment to reproductivity that made me feel odd, but also the fact of being an avid consumer of the future, as well as being afraid of it. Having been around to see Threads when it was new means, unfortunately, that I'm old, and old enough to predate the putative reappropriation of queer as a rallying point for the anti-heteronormative resistance. Queer was something I was called in the playground and in the street. It's not working? Oh, okay, sorry. and in diatribes usually peppered with foul, is that right? With foul language, from which I still find it difficult to detach the term. In the British vernacular, where the term originates, queer intended shadiness, spivery, and deceit, as well as oddness and eccentricity. So it's quite difficult if you've experienced that in a visceral way to just say, oh, okay, yeah, it's now it's something that we can get on board with, and we're going to reappropriate it, and it's all great. As queer as a 9-bob note was a phrase in idiomatic usage before decimalization, gauging oddity relative to the circulation of value and currency. Perhaps the radical street artist Banksy was picking up on this queer energy when in 2004 he produced the subversive Diana £10 note. The late divorced and detached former princess, gay icon, AIDS and landmines activist was already a sufficiently oblique figure for the idea of her crowned head circulating on legal tender to be a queer affront. And he made several £1 million worth of these and distributed them at festivals, but people started spending them at the one in Reading. And he realized he was at risk of going to jail for counterfeiting money, so it had to be removed. Yeah, there's about 50 of them left now, which are worth a fortune. So while Princess Diana was living a fairy tale gone wrong, I went through a school system in which I learned almost nothing. It was basically like being in prison. And the bullying was not only from the other inmates, but also from the superintendents. My first opportunity for working out a queer identity and politicizing the lived experience of difference didn't come until I started postdoctoral work. At that time, pursuing research informed by queer theory and working in the ambit of LGBT studies was considered quite edgy. Someone at Oxbridge coming out as gay or lesbian as a professor would make the news. Peter Tatchell at that time was running mock gay weddings in Trafalgar Square, and outrage was storming Canterbury Cathedral to challenge the Archbishop on the anti-gay policies of the Church of England. AIDS, which was still untreatable then, cast gays as a minority threatened with extinction. Several decades later, LGBT studies is no longer regarded as edgy or radical. In political structures, at least, the admission price to the collective has been diminished greatly, so that feeling that one is out of sorts with the status quo in some way is sufficient to satisfy the entry criteria. I have to say that this development worries me. The loss of meaningful discursive space is also allied, I would argue, to the loss of real space as meeting places for LGBT people, which are fast disappearing off the map. In Gay Bar, Why We Went Out, Jeremy Atherton makes a convincing case for why these spaces are important. And a flip side of queer misalignment with the future seems also to have been a reluctance to claim or chronicle the past. Atherton poses the question of whether subcultures are heritageable at all. That's one of the new trends in academia. Everything's about heritage. And he also cites Ben Walter's observation that the queer archive is fragile from fear and forgetting of a history too often written in whispers and lived in scraps. So we're kind of misaligned with the future, and we also don't do a very good job of recording our history. No future and no past. If LGBT identities and scholarship is seen as old hat in the academy, this doesn't reflect a similar satiety in the wider society. On the contrary, as the most recent UK survey of LGBT people carried out on a national scale by the British government found in 2018, for example, 40% of the more than 100,000 respondents had experienced verbal harassment or physical violence within 12 months of completing the questionnaire. A quarter had needed to access mental health services. Even more striking, in my humble opinion, were the first-person accounts included in the final report. For example, a respondent who was 16 in 2018 wrote that a teacher who knew I was gay called me out to speak about my experiences, and it made me and the rest of the class highly uncomfortable. I also had a teacher who used gay as a derogatory term, and when I called them out about it, they said I was overreacting and that I should shut up. There is then an odd coexistence of an ennui with queer persons and our scholarship in the academy, and the continued experience of homophobia, transphobia, and biphobia in everyday life, in family life, and in primary and secondary education. The more diffuse and mainstream queer theory becomes, the more remote it is, arguably, from its source. and the more LGBT people return to being marooned as epistemological refugees. In this regard, I found telling the poor critical reception of the most recent series in the sex education franchise. The grim school where misfits gather in a dilapidated outhouse has been replaced by a postmodern building that's open plan, natural light, glass, and chrome. The misfits are now the establishment, led by a character who seems like a pale imitation of Boy George, circa 1984. The identities of these new characters and their backstories aren't addressed, as if it would be in bad taste even to ponder where they might situate themselves relative to identities knowable through sexual orientation or gender. Honestly, who cares? That's so yesterday's current thing. More optimistically, the series includes a credible presentation of disability, and the two main male characters, whose friendship is pivotal to the narrative, finally recognize that they have racial identities. I've watched this with people from a younger generation, and they also seem to find that it lacks credibility. It's as if the program had been developed from a discarded first draft of a futures lab on post-compulsory education. It should have gone in the bin. For all its faults, this program does allow me to pivot from the ortho-ethnographic part of this presentation to some thoughts about queer energy and sustainability. You'll notice the bicycles in the pictures on the slide. In the last series of this show, cars are no longer a status symbol. The in-crowd ride bikes to school, recycle, and eat plants. The school is paperless. Each student is equipped with a tablet that resembles a slate. In this incredible space, then, concerns about energy use, green issues, and sustainability are intimately worked into a narrative that began with sex and gender. And I would argue that there's been a queer aspect to the critique of a fossil fuel and growth-based economy from the early period of environmentalism. By way of example, here are some pages from Heathcote Williams' 1991 prose poem, Autogeddon. He writes on the right of this slide, "Were an alien visitor to hover a few hundred yards above the planet, it could be forgiven for thinking that cars were the dominant life form, and that human beings were a kind of ambulatory fuel cell, injected when the car wished to move off and ejected when they were spent. If the visitor's curiosity was still aroused, it would quickly discover on landing from hoardings, newspapers, and television commercials that the car appeared to satisfy a compendious spectrum of desires, sexual, social, economic. The visitor moves in for a closer look. Cars are being washed, caressed, polished, and petted as if they were members of the family." William's stance here is one that strikes me as worthy of being called queer. It makes the world strange and weirds the relationship between cars and their drivers. Energy and being queer also have in common an element of indefinableness. As physicist Richard Feynman said, "We don't know what energy is. All we know is that it comes in packages and changes form." So, the Nobel laureate in physics cannot tell us what energy is. It's still a mystery, even though we can't do anything without it. Now, some queer types have been involved in discoveries of how to produce, harness, and distribute this mysterious entity. Nikola Tesla, who ended his days alone in a grim New York hotel room, communing with pigeons. Rudolf Diesel, whose death at sea remains a great mystery, albeit one which Douglas Brunt claims to have solved in his book, Genius, Power, and Deception on the Eve of World War I, which came out earlier this year. Where I would like to take this is to the critique of current models of sustainability and green energy models, which are the orthodox paradigm for our future at the moment. And one of the things I took from the school in July, Roumiana, was that it really is quite difficult to figure out how to think outside those established directions of travel. And also maybe very aware of just how significant cinema and literature narratives are in shaping our imaginations. I really hadn't realized that before, even though I work in literature. So taking a deep dive into the work of sustainability skeptics such as Simon Michaud, Mark Mills, Stephen Koonin, and Decouple Media, and this is an area that seems to be very dominated by people whom we might identify or who might identify themselves as male. That obviously has some significance, which I haven't really got time to go into here. I would say there's something queer that pertains to their critique. For example, the frequent recourse to metaphorical strategies that are about weirding and making strange. They point out, for example, that the succession of internal combustion energy cars by an electric car isn't the same sort of step change as was meant by the replacement of horses by automobiles. An equivalent adaptation would instead have been to feed horses some new foodstuff other than hay. Michaud describes oil as a steak wrapped in bacon compared to rebuildable, not renewable energy, which would be lettuce. So you need 1,000 enormous wind turbines to produce the same energy output as one small coal power plant. To cover fossil fuel, sorry, I skipped a bit. The figures in Michaud's report on the material requirements to transition from fossil fuels to an electricity-based infrastructure are mind-boggling. To cover the fossil fuels with wind and solar would, according to his report, there's some screen grabs from the slides, which you can find online there, would require 2.1 million new wind turbines and 27.6 billion solar panels. 4.5 billion tons of copper would need to be mined to create the wiring required for transmission in this all-electric grid. And the projection doesn't allow for the 800 million people who are still off the grid any chance to get on it. There's another thing that shocked me from looking at this. There are 800 million people in the world who still don't have regular access to electricity. And at current rates of extraction, it would take nearly 1,000 years to mine enough lithium to create the batteries required to back up an all-electric global grid. So far as I know, these renewability skeptics are not in the pockets of the fossil fuel industry or of what I've seen called petro-masculinity, which is a kind of interesting fusion of gender explorations and a skeptical view about the fossil fuel industry. Their position is a queer one, I would say, in as much as it presents inconvenient truths about the transition model that has become part of the orthodox view of what the future can and must look like. It seems hard to believe that the more green a polity becomes, the more the economic structures under its jurisdiction will consume fossil fuels, and yet this seems to be true. Decouple Media's Colossal Coal Pits, a visit to the giant hole in Germany's energy transition, is illustrative. We see wind turbines being taken down, not put up, to allow for the expansion of lignite mines in the Rhineland. The mines are just expanding and expanding and expanding, and where there are areas where they've put up wind turbines, they're just taking them down and burying entire towns and villages. Decommissioning Germany's nuclear fleet left a gap in the electricity supply, and it's not being filled by rebuildable nor by gas. Conspiracy theorists have some fun with this. I mean, it's Putin is behind this, do some ideological subversion in Germany, put everybody off nuclear power, close down nuclear power plants, turn off the gas, and then they're stuffed. So the driverless electric car of the future then is a queer artifact in more ways than one. How will the nuclear family arrange itself inside the passenger cabin, where all the seats are passenger seats, and Dad can't sit behind the wheel because there isn't a wheel? And where is the electricity that powers it going to come from? And where and how and with what fuel will the materials that make up the battery be mined? These seem to me like questions that come from a queer place. On the other hand, I'm very conscious of the interlacing of eccentricity and of a tendency to apocalypticism in my own biography, which makes me wonder if it might not be queer experience that leads me, after fears of a nuclear holocaust, of peak oil, of economic and social collapse, to be drawn again to a full-stop anti-future. Notwithstanding those caveats, the sustainability skeptics, queer energists perhaps, might have something to say to future studies, in that if their critique is valid, the current narrative of energy for the future may be one that's not possible, never mind sustainable.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for interviewing queer theory with autobiography, with energy futures. Really a rough ride. Thank you so much. We will have a few questions at the end. So right now, I'm really, can you go one slide further, please? Thank you. Right now, we're moving over to some locals here from Paris, and we're really happy to have you around. It's Juliette Grossmann and Daniel Kaplan from Plurality University Network. Juliette has a background in philosophy in the Sorbonne University here, where she's currently pursuing a PhD, but she also describes herself as philosopher on the go, going back and forward between theory and practice, which resonates with the futures field a bit, we hope. And Daniel has a senior background in foresight, but a good couple of years ago decided to pursue other ways, go more creative, co-creative, go more transformative, and he founded an NGO called the Plurality University Network. They do a good couple of projects in and around Paris, and we're really happy to hear from you insights from your organizations and your projects. Your floor and your pointer.
Thank you very much. So tell me if this distance is okay. Thank you. Closer? Okay. Thank you very much, Ludwig. We're very happy to be here and to talk about queer futuring. It was a great opportunity for us to have great discussions within our team. So thank you very much for that. As you said, I'm sorry, I can't see I don't have my glasses. Okay. Yeah. Oh, no, it's okay. So yeah, like Ludwig said, my name is Juliette Grossmann. I'm doing a PhD in philosophy. So it's an action research project with the Plurality University Network. And we developed a project called Collective Creative Practices for Transformation. And we're going to talk about this today. So in my thesis, I focus on understanding the epistemological grounds of such creative and critical practices of futuring. And other than that, I'm very much engaged in developing and experimenting alternative methods of futuring with U+. So U+ is University Plurality. Yeah. So U+ was founded by Daniel and Chloe, who is here in the public listening to us. We are a nonprofit based in Paris. We're a very small team, but we work internationally with a big network of people from different countries. And yeah, we are gathered around the mission of exploring and opening the possibilities for just and sustainable futures by mobilizing resources of the imagination, that is art, fiction, speculation, mainly. And we recognize that the ecological and social transformation comes from questioning dominant and oppressive representations. And that is why we're here today in this panel. So I won't be able in these short minutes to get into too much details, of course, about these practices. But it's a shame because, as I said to Ludwig yesterday, the devil lies in the details. So who is producing the narratives of the future and how are they produced? So to get into the project, the Collective Creative Practices project, so it's an open research project. What we do is we identify these practices that use artistic methods to create collective narratives for eco-social transformation. So we gather practitioners, we create spaces for debates, discussions, and experimentations. We identify common grounds and common issues, and we analyze in U+ our own practice, considering the lessons that we learned from other practitioners. So you might notice that we don't use particularly the words future and queer, even though we're on the panel of queer futuring. First, on the future matter, the people who develop these practices, are not necessarily futurists. They can be artists, researchers, they have multiple professional identities, even if they all use the future in the sense of Riel Miller here. So in the words of Inayatullah, the future that we're talking about here is not a place, but a feeling, a possibility of change. And regarding the word queer, some of the practitioners that we work with recognize their practice as queer and others don't. And it's not a label that you can put on others. especially since the use of the word queer largely depends on the political nature of the space in which it's used, like Ryan introduced earlier. But if you take queering as a verb, as an approach linked to the queer perspective, to challenge, to challenge the basis on which categories are constructed, then it is both the point of entry and the point of destination that of these practices. So from the first year and a half of this project, after identifying almost 100 practices and projects, organizing multiple gatherings and organizing interviews, writing articles with Chloe and Daniel, we formulated 4 main dimensions of these transformative practices. So they are not categories, but it's a way of organizing the understanding of how these practices enable transformation, the transformation that they are willing to bring about. The motivation behind the CCP project is highly political. We want to put light on them, to underline their specificities, their originalities, and find common grounds to enable alliances and political alliances. So the first, this is the cover of our book made by Juliette Lépinot, a great illustrator, graphist. And you can find all of this info in our book that you can find online. It's free on our website. So the first dimension is experimental, or you could say experiential. So I will focus on how each dimension relates to the queer perspective as a transversal perspective. I can't get into too much details, but I think you still get it. So here, experimental in the sense of testing new methods, but also experiential regarding the importance of embodied experiences that constitute these practices, and in the sense of experimental art that creates strangeness, both through methods of discomfort in workshops and the creation of weird narratives in order to address normativity. So this is a hybrid creature from the Creatures Project that focuses on experimental art for sustainability in the UK. The next dimension is about inclusivity. So rapidly, this dimension starts with asking the question, who is in the room and who is not? Along with what Fliner and Cobble call an ethic of openness and embrace of difference. So this image of literally multiple points of view is from the Reimaginary project. It's an international project that focuses on human and non-human relationships. The third dimension is critical, of course. The critical perspective is an obvious condition when you work on change, political change, and you look for a future that is very different from the past and the present. But queerness invites us to dig deeper into the power dynamics and the subversion of dichotomies. This piece of art was presented by the Center for Rewilding. It's a practice based in Australia. And they focus on what they call forever lost, overlooked, and undervalued knowledges to face climate change, working mainly with Indigenous knowledge. And the last dimension is exploratory. So because these practices are about opening possibilities, the exploration involves embracing ambiguity, which means considering the plurality of interpretations of a narrative without looking for consensus or a conclusion, but rather coexistence and dialogue. So this is a drawing from a participant from the Science Fiction Comedy, who was a practice based in France that focuses on the dialogue between artistic and scientific knowledge. So now I'm going to pass the floor to Daniel, who's going to give more details about an example of a practice.
The remote. Thank you. Thanks, Juliette. I'll pick up on Juliette's exploratory item and maybe a few others, with this time an example of a project that we led in France, which is called the Emerging Enterprise. So in 2021 and 22, about 150 people from 50 corporations came together in different workshops at different times with us and with 5 science fiction writers to invent together 12 fictional corporations of 2050, with only one constraint, which was to be compatible with something that we didn't describe, and that we just called the new climate regime. They had to put whatever meaning they wanted to that. They did that, and then they took some time reflecting on what this process had done to them, and also on what they had put and not put in those stories. Then an analysis, and sorry, I'm asking for the remote and then not doing anything with it. Yes. Oh, this one, the green button that is not green. Okay. So an analysis of these stories, let me back up a little bit, produced what we call 10 archetypes of what corporations could become in the future, to which a number of corporate types, trade unionists, academics, and others reacted in publications that we will start putting out, also open access within the next months. So this is a step in the process. We're publishing, and of course, what happens next is also very important in the process, but it's being designed. However, we've already had initial returns by participants telling us that it's been helping them explore and challenge possibilities that were either marginal or entirely not on the radar in their organizations or beyond, and in their previous strategic discussions on the future of their own corporations. So what is queer about that? Well, maybe in one sense of the word, it's at least weird that while there is plenty of foresight within corporations, we have hardly found any foresight about corporations, as if these types of organizations had been around forever and would be around as we know them forever. I'm in a distinguished assembly, so I hope you can prove me wrong, but we've really been looking for a long time, and we've only found 2 things that look like foresight on corporations. There's plenty on work, but it's not the same. Or at least it's only part of the issue. So that's one maybe surprise, or it seemed like we were in uncharted territory, and we still don't understand why this territory is uncharted. But anyway, the second thing maybe, obviously we're hardly the first to be using science fiction with foresight, but maybe our use of fiction is a little specific. First of all, after the initial workshop, we really handle the keys to the science fiction writers. We're helping them. They're not helping us do the work. And the science fiction writers themselves do not do the writing. They are here to help participants write fiction together about things that matter to them. And the only constraints that we put to them are narrative, to tell good stories, to imagine situations that have their own inner tension and that can be interested for somebody who wasn't in the room and who will look at the results. We specifically do not ask participants to write positive or realistic story or to incorporate this or that trend within the story. That is not our role. It's theirs to imagine what has to be in it and what it makes sense for them to put in it. So fiction here is not there to illustrate existing ideas. It's not there to convey specific messages, it is definitely a means of exploration of what might be in certain arbitrary conditions that the participants have created themselves as well. As a result for us, and that might be the third point, the best stories coming out of the emerging enterprise, first, they're the most complex stories. They're usually neither utopian nor dystopian. Even this distinction obviously doesn't make sense when we get people to tell stories by themselves. They contain contradictions, they're ambiguous, they leave ample space for interpretation, and actually that's why they're valuable, because people can do something out of those stories. So the value of the futures we produce there doesn't just lie, or maybe doesn't even mainly lie, in their content, but in, first of all, what creating them has done to the participants, and also in how these futures can be used as cues, as provocations for transformative thinking, which is where we're headed now, which is why we're asking people to react not on the very serious work that we can do, but to react on the archetypes and the stories as if they were real, as if they were concrete scenarios. So time is almost up. The last maybe queer thing is that obviously this kind of foresight is a weird object in the eyes of organizations. It is clearly producing some insights that were not on the radar before and that often seem obvious after the fact. It clearly interacts with conversations happening within those organizations on disruption, on purpose, on adaptation to climate change, on ESG, or on the unusual expectations of young recruits whom we don't really understand in these organizations, but it doesn't produce the clear, easily understood, actionable results that, oh, these are the publications, sorry, that executives tend to expect from foresight. So maybe borrowing heavily from Riel's vocabulary, the kind of work that this is doing, and it's not all of foresight, it's a very specific kind of work, is here to explore new and uncharted possibilities. It's here to focus on transformations without being excessively bounded by existing categories, by existing boundaries, including those of possible, plausible, desirable, and all those terms that is on the cone of futures. So, meaning that the challenge, and that's really the end for me, the next challenge is to design the ways for people to be able to seize on these stories to do something. So how can you connect that without removing all the asperities of those stories with foresight or strategic processes, but also maybe with innovation, social and technology, be with political discussions, with research, with activism, etc. And these are things that we are currently experimenting. But again, this content is open source. So if you want to experiment with it as well, it'll be in English a little later. You can too.
Just a little conclusion, maybe, that if you had to keep two ideas of what we said, we wanted to add to the words that Ludwig proposed at the beginning, the word ambiguity. This is very important in the work that we do because it leaves space for interpretation, and it obliges us to focus on dialogue and how you create dialogue around the narratives. And this is linked to what Maya very interestingly said earlier about polylogue. I really love that idea of polylogue, and also insist on this question that we should ask ourselves as practitioners when we do a workshop, for example, of who is in the room and who is not, and why is that, and how do we create spaces that embrace different perspectives.
Thank you so much. And I would like to add that they say not so much mainstream foresight futures perspectives and activities you're pursuing are also manifesting in the space you use. You're in a not really squatted, but reused campus building of Sorbonne, where there is an ecosystem of young experimental NGOs interacting. It's really great to visit if you spend more time in Paris. Yeah, thank you so much. And we see how queer theory can actually be translated into methods and into experimentation and can be used in stakeholder context. So it actually produces novel, maybe not so foreseen or anticipated results in our practices. So thank you so much for your input. And where's the, I think you go. Moving on, and actually with respect to time also, yeah, coming slowly to not slowly to the final and concluding presentation of our panel. We have Roumiana Gotseva and Riel Miller. So I will keep the introduction considerably short. Both are senior members of various futures communities. Both have senior expertise in foresight and futures work. Roumiana went through the Houston School, is currently, and that's really great, pursuing a late career PhD in a British school where she researches herself and her way of becoming, probably professionally, epistemologically, who she is today. And in that, the idea of queering, weirding, making strange resonates a lot, at least as how I could learn from you. And Riel obviously developed futures literacy, and queering, making strange also plays into him trying to initiate and produce alternative anticipatory assumptions. So he is trying to go new ways on a regular basis. And we would like to hear from the two, how does this topic, from your vast knowledge of the community, how does the topic of queer futures resonate with your work, with your background? Please wrap it up for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ludwig. I'll speak for about 5 minutes and then Riel, I'll pass it to you. And today I'll be talking more as a researcher or an action researcher in our art space, craft space kind of methodology. And I'm starting with this idea of the web of weird, because weird comes from the Anglo-Saxon word weird with a Y, which is actually from the Norse cosmology as a symbol of one of the runes that is encompassing all of the runes of the Norse cosmology and is a symbol of the weaving of the threads of life. The three Norns who weave, and I add felt because I use felting as a craft, but work with threads to create fate and destiny. But fate and destiny in an indeterminate way. So basically, the idea is that your destiny is not determined, but you weave it together with the Norns as you go along in life. And for me, this is a metaphor for not just for emergence and to pay attention to how we are in the present for futures otherwise, but it's also a feminist way of knowing. It's a women's way of knowing, kind of the weaving, the crafting, the felting, the crocheting, someone mentioned, and all of these crafts that use fiber and touch, because touch is a different sense and sensibility from the mind and vision and images. So it gets us in the body. And I think that that's important to challenge some of those some of the metaphors, and it's about indeterminacy at the crossroads or in the decision choices, which is in the liminalities, right? And it's kind of a Schrodinger's cat paradox, you know, what will appear when I change, for instance, when I touch a little bit of wool, as we did in the workshop with Stephanie on Tuesday, what changes? What changes when I encounter the agency of the other? Whether that other is material or the other, and the boundary or the borderland between the permeable borders in the liminal space, right? Part of this ambition or part of this exploration is in a challenge to chrononormativity. And to all sorts of normativities, but my research is more on chrononormativity, on this idea that time is linear, progressive. It's a challenge to Enlightenment time, to clock time, and to Greenwich Mean Time. which is basically it was called railroad time, railway time, because when Greenwich Mean Time was invented, it was invented to synchronize productivity across the world, across the globe. It was for the trains to run on time. And how do we challenge that? Plus, there's another dimension here, which is very interesting, is that as the rational mode of perception and research and science developed, we actually spatialized time as a dimension. So time became mostly on the vertical, it became upwards, and on the horizontal, it became to the right and forward. It doesn't have to be that way. Time can be a dimension of its own, and it doesn't have to be spatialized along these categories. Plus, even if it is, there's the vertical also goes down to humus, and it can go left or back. So the past and the present in the now as well. It doesn't mean the time needs to be necessarily linear. The past is in the past and the present is now, thick or thin. It doesn't matter, but the future is forward. Within the Norse cosmology and many other indigenous cosmologies, and within quantum mechanics, these are all problematized. The dimensions of time can coincide. They can be simultaneous. They can go backwards and forwards and mixed in and be very weird, right? But not only that, but from again, a more political point of view, this kind of chrononormativity or the linear progression of time actually has rendered Black, queer, feminine, disabled, indigenous bodies to be out of time in the sense that their labor has been used to build the empires, but they were not even accepted in the category of the human. So there is a kind of a strong message from these marginalized minoritarian communities to question the linearity of progress time on the gilded highway to the future, as Bio would say, Bio Kumulafe. There also, we know that from different indigenous and different cultures, time can be imagined in different ways. For instance, in Indonesia, there is the term, I think it's called jam karet or yam karet, which means rubber time. And that's not an excuse for people showing up late, right? I've been called the late Bulgarian, and I think that's very derogatory from British partners when we started working after the 90s. The late Bulgarian is already you're disappeared, right? You're rendered non-existent in a humorous way, ironic. But it also says something. There's a pejoration there. The term is not symmetrical. So from a feminist Bulgarian point of view, I have a position around this, right? And not just be from different points of view of all of these linked oppressions. And as Kodwoeshan says, today power functions through the envisioning, management, and delivery of reliable futures. The powerful employ futurists and draw power from futures they endorse, whereby condemning the disempowered to live in the past. The present moment is stretching, slipping for some into yesterday, reaching for others into tomorrow. And chronopolitics is about exactly that kind of destabilization of the norms, of the taking for granted, of the common sense, and the meanings and the resulting power relations. So in opposition to progress time, there are speculative temporalities that do not synchronize with the established or taken for granted understanding of time. And I like this quote from O'Reilly that this is to show what is at stake in anticipatory practices that might be able to create a sufficiently liminal space to our theme of knowledge power to make a future not already policed by preformed knowledge boundaries. And so many of these strategies there's queer futures or queer time, crypt time, feminist futurisms, Afrofuturisms, indigenous futurisms, and even tropical futurisms, with kind of trying to imagine a different relationship with the land. And in that sense, also entanglement which I use in my felting. So it's like a study of entanglement or a study of what can emerge. And within quantum mechanics, entanglement means something very specific. Karen Barad writes a lot about this. And then there, the ideas of past, present, and future are very intertwined. I won't read the quote because it's too long. And I'll just finish with this last comment. The creative anticipation is what we call it. I call it, but I found that others call it too, is attuning to this entanglement or to the web of weird in the present. As John Keats called it, he called it negative capability. When a man, and this is historicity, right? His social imaginary. When a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, meaning exploring the unknowable and being okay with not knowing, or actually using not knowing as a resource in a positive way. Thank you very much. And I'll pass it to. Thank you.
Hello there. Thank you very much. Given quite a bit of thought to this opportunity. Had a very interesting discussion with my daughter, who's 24, last night about what can somebody like me say safely. Because after all, it's really obvious I'm a privileged white male of a certain age and all that. What do I know, or what can I claim about weird or queer? And it's not easy for me to express why it was important for me. So I feel very privileged to be on this panel, to be part of a panel talking about weird and liminal and queer. And my first, in some senses, deepest reaction has to do with something that seems, in some ways, dangerous for the beauty and the value of what is weird and what is queer, because it universalizes it. I kind of always felt weird, and I was often called weird. Some people still do. And it was a luxury that I could afford, right? I mean, I'm not in big danger, really. So being weird, yeah, I've got the agility, the chops to make that work. But when I try to think about why futures literacy was something that was important to me over 30, 40 years of reflection and experience, it's really because I kind of want everyone to be an artist, everyone to be weird, everyone to be able to appreciate not belonging and being different. But what became really clear was that you need to have the capacity to do that. So it's not in a sense that I want to, universalize or share my privilege. The real issue for me became, are there means for us to live more comfortably in a world that I think, in a universe that I think is fundamentally weird and is going to continuously queer us because that's the way this universe is. And so I don't know how to position myself in some senses from a political or a power perspective, because I'm not contextualizing it that way. But if I have something that I wanted to share about novelty, about surprise, about breaking the known, it's that it's more comfortable. It's more agreeable to be in that universe because that's the way our universe is. And so to me, the idea of futures literacy, novelty, cultivating difference, being able to continuously appreciate and enlarge your own sphere of difference, is a way of being. And it has to do, of course, with many experiences that I had over time, including the existential atomic bomb threat, where you know, at a very early age, I really felt, well, the species is going to kill itself. This is completely crazy. There's got to be something profoundly wrong, and obviously an immense disillusion with the ideologies of the 19th century, for obvious reasons, I think, because I think they're fairly catastrophic. But that was the negative, right? That was what pushed me to think, well, how can you be different? How can difference be the fundamental attribute of everything that happens? And futures literacy is kind of a means to that end, and as a way of walking the talk. So that's what I had to share, and it's quite. I hope you see it's personal, but I hope it also resonates, because, in fact, if I'm here, it's because, in a way that I'm very suspicious of, and I feel rather vulnerable about, I think that's something I want to share with everybody. Now, that's pretentious and that's, you know, arrogant in a way, but that's what I do.